Hi, I'm Maria Rana, and I'm the Literary Director of the Library of Congress. Welcome to the first of our new 2020 fall programs for the National Book Festival Presents. As many of you know, this series was created to continue year-round the spirited energy that our annual National Book Festival always engenders. Speaking of the festival, I should mention here that although we unveiled the 2020 festival a few weeks ago, it is still very much alive. You can find a rich array of 100 programs across many genres and for many ages on loc.gov/bookfest. You can also find the 2-hour PBS television special that includes many of our festival stars on the pbs.org address that you see in the description on this video or below here on your screen. The theme of the festival this year, our 20th year, is American Ingenuity, and it is also the theme of the National Book Festival Presents program today. We wanted our feature speakers to answer the question, what does American ingenuity mean to you exactly? What does it mean to transform challenge to opportunity and be ingenious, creative, and solution-oriented in the moment? I can't think of two more fitting and eloquent authors to address this theme than our friends Danielle Allen and Walter Isaacson. So let me introduce them for you here. Danielle Allen is the 2020 recipient of the Library of Congress's prestigious John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity. She was elected to that role because she's joined so brilliantly her scholarship in history and philosophy to these contemporary times, and because she's done so much to bring these subjects to the public square. She is the James Bryant Conant Professor at Harvard University, where she also directs the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. Among her laurels, which are really far too many to mention, is her indispensable book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality, in which she takes us step by step through the meaning of every word and phrase of that remarkable founding document. Walter Isaacson is the Leonard Lauder Professor of American History and Values at Tulane University. He's a highly accomplished and prolific journalist, as well as an acclaimed biographer. He has given us unforgettable portraits of Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, Steve Jobs, and many other ingenious Americans. His most recent biography is about one of the world's great geniuses, Leonardo da Vinci, and in it, Walter sheds new light on how Leonardo's science and art are inextricably linked. Walter's great gift is to show us how ingenuity can range widely and how it can spring from the most unexpected quarters. Please welcome our very special guests, Walter Isaacson and Danielle Allen.
Good morning, Walter. How are you?
Good morning, Danielle, and thanks for being with me on this thing.
Oh, such a pleasure. You are the prophet of ingenuity, so I'm
well,
super
you
curious.
wrote about the greatest ingenuity of all, which is creating America and so many other things, and congratulations on what you're doing now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much,
And
Walter.
your wonderful prize.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've always loved coming to the National Book Festival. It's really so exciting to be there in the convention center spaces. I know it's digital this year, but I hope that all the energy, the creativity unleashed, the chance to discover new things, the happenstance discoveries are still a part of this year's festival. It's a joy of learning and celebration.
Yeah, I've been at the festival, I think it was 2008, 2012, 2015 for Steve Jobs, Einstein, and then the innovators. And it's always been a way to just rub elbows with people. And I hope that soon, when the pandemic recedes and the earth begins to heal, being together in person at a place like that, I can go back and remember Jim Billington on his golf cart when we were doing it on the mall, to today. It's just a special, magical moment where we celebrate ideas. You know, if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, I've been a flatterer of the National Book Festival for a long time. I went to the Aspen Institute. We created something called the Aspen Ideas Festival. And I said, it should just be like the great National Book Festival on the mall where people are talking in different venues about great ideas. And now that I'm back here in New Orleans at Tulane University, we've created, and we'll start next March, the New Orleans Book Festival. You know, during my career, I've met a lot of smart people, and it suddenly dawned on me that smart people are a dime a dozen. They don't usually amount to much. What really counts is being innovative, having ingenuity, and that's the ability to connect discovery to invention, to something that's useful. It's exactly that was in the core of Benjamin Franklin's soul, Steve Jobs' soul, and even Leonardo da Vinci. And so to me, I love that concept of ingenuity because it feels not only American, but something that we've helped flourish over here. Danielle, what's your thoughts there?
Well, I love ingenuity as a feature of our cultural life. So I've always loved the writings of Mark Twain and Ralph Ellison on the kind of figures of the trickster, in all honesty. You know, sort of, I'm thinking of Melville's Confidence Man. I'm thinking of Ellison's incredible characters who find their way through our complex social world, inventing things as they go, inventing stories, inventing reasons for people to be connected with each other, making new things from the sheer power of their storytelling. So there's a lot of different aspects of American ingenuity. The innovation, just as you said, Walter, but there's also this sort of daredevil willingness to kind of play make-believe until it's real and see what comes from that.
That was one of Steve Jobs' strengths, was that ability to stand at the intersection of the arts and the sciences. And that, he said, allowed you to think different. And that was something key to Steve Jobs, more so than Bill Gates and some of the others, was that he truly loved the humanities, loved poetry and calligraphy and dance. And he said that led to his ingenuity because he could always think out of the box.
That's funny. I always do think of ingenuity as being about lines of sight that don't fit in boxes, where people are able to see beyond, able to see things other people haven't seen yet. It's as if people can conjure up patterns in our social universe before others have even seen how the pieces are coming together. And that's something that matters in politics just as much as it does in culture. So the Declaration of Independence, for example, is in a certain way a great example of playing make-believe until you make it real. We're incredible ideals for humanity. There was a vision there of what was possible for human beings. Not everybody subscribed to the full breadth of that vision. And yet here we are, able to realize it progressively from one generation to the next. So that's another way in which sort of what ingenuity does is lay out a path for people before they've gotten there, actually, so that others can follow along afterwards.
I love how in our declaration, your wonderful book, you talk about it as an act of ingenuity, an act of creation, that you're going to have a new type of nation, unlike any other that had existed before, that's based on a particular idea or almost a mission statement. And you see, you know, the three characters who are on that committee, Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson, trying to craft that we hold these truths to be, you know, and I think Jefferson writes sacred, and Franklin turns it to self-evident. Well, we're just inventing a new nation.
The fact that we are able to invent ourselves with ideas and with cultural creations is one of the extraordinary things of our culture, I believe. And I'm really curious to know, Walter, how you've picked the specific characters you've focused on. I mean, it's clear that Jobs has transformed our world without any doubt. But how about some of the other people that you picked? Why were they the ones that you really settled on as your best examples of ingenuity?
Well, for Ben Franklin, it was that ability to connect his love of science and his curiosity. I mean, when he was a little kid running away to England, he would measure the water in the Atlantic Ocean and helps discover the Gulf Stream, but because he was so curious. And then he connects both his science and his curiosity, not only to doing things like creating lightning rods and very ingenious devices, but understanding checks and balances and how you use the Enlightenment science to create a new type of nation. And after doing him, I realized that science was so core to his mission. I wanted to do Einstein. After I did, Ben Franklin and Einstein, Steve Jobs came to me and said, do me next. And I said, okay, Ben Franklin, Einstein, you. But then I realized that he too had that ingenuity that came from connecting it. You said something interesting a moment ago about lines of sight, and it reminds me of Leonardo da Vinci, because he studied optics and he studied the mathematics of perspective and how light enters the eye. He even dissected the human eye to see how it worked. And to me, from that, he's able to do the smile of the Mona Lisa or that trick perspective you see in the Last Supper. So it was a very concrete example of ingenuity coming from standing at that intersection of the arts and the sciences. I was going to ask you, Danielle, to what extent do the sciences at all inform the people you've written about?
Well, Ben Franklin matters to me as well. And I love hearing you talk about him as a scientist, because for me, he's such a sort of creative spirit with regard to human social relations. And I think it's infrequent that we actually think of science and the humanities as living together. And yet, I think you're right that they really do belong together, that in both cases, there is an interest in human flourishing. The question of what is it that we can see around us where there's potential to make something more, to convert potential energy into kinetic energy and bring about new human possibilities. So in general, I have been much more focused on people who conjure new worlds with words rather than with experiments. And yet I think there is a synergy between those two efforts. And it really is, again, I want to use that metaphor of unlocking or unleashing potential energy, turning it into something kinetic, setting new dynamics into motion. The thing that is interesting to me about the folks that you've selected, the people I've been interested in always, is that I think the motivation for their ingenuity has really been what I call sort of a philanthropic spirit, a genuine love of humankind. So I'm curious whether you think that that sort of love of humankind has been an important part of the stories of ingenuity that you've been interested in, or do you think the motivation doesn't matter? Anybody can be sort of have ingenuity. You don't have to be motivated by human well-being or human progress.
I think you have to be deeply connected to the idea of human desires and human loves, and that allows you to create anything from the iPod to Vitruvian Man to the lightning rod. All the ingenious people I've written about started with a passion that was pure curiosity. But one of the things we have to learn in life, and this is something that graduation speakers sometimes forget, they keep saying, follow your passion, follow your passion. Well, it's not just about following your passion. It's about connecting your passion to something larger than yourself, something where, as Steve Jobs said when he was dying, I said, what was your motivation? He said, I used to think that life was like a river and you got to take wonderful, ingenious things out of the river that people had invented before you. But now I know that life is about what you get to put into the river that other people will use.
Absolutely. That's beautifully said.
You know, you connect things from history and make them resonate today, which I've always loved. I remember you did your book, I think, Prometheus, about punishment in ancient Greece and Rome. And now we're going through a period where we're trying to figure out what is justice, what is punishment. I was wondering how you see the echoes in history like that.
Well, you know, it's funny. I do think that history echoes, history provides contrasts that open up our eyes, our spirits, our minds. I wrote that book on punishment in ancient Athens because I grew up in the 1980s in Southern California, where incarceration was just ballooning all around us. I went to college and I took a class on ancient Athenian democracy. We spent the semester reading courtroom speeches, one after the other, case of a sort of plaintiff or a defendant. And I knew something was bugging me about these texts. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And one day I got it. And I raised my hand in class and I said to my professor, why is there no mention of imprisonment anywhere in these courtroom texts? Do they not have imprisonment in ancient Athens? And my professor said, well, that would make a great dissertation topic, Danielle, in fact. So then I was sort of off to the races on that subject. But the more important point is just that here I was, this 18-year-old kid from Southern California. And I always think of human beings as sensors. We register things in our environment. I didn't have any training in sociology. I didn't have any training in criminal justice, but I was registering the fact that all around me, this penal system was growing. And so then when I encountered a fragment from another world with a different kind of penal system, I felt that contrast. And that contrast triggered my interest in understanding more about what was possible for us, how our world could be different. But I want to tell that story, or I tell that story because it's so important for me to underscore how every kid out there is registering the world around them. And we have to recognize, I do think, the power and potential of young people to show us how our world's changing, what matters in our world, we need to listen to them. And I want to suggest that maybe for your next project, Walter, there would be a great project to be done about young people as sources of ingenuity, sources of creativity. They see things, I think, before some of us older people do.
Well, as it happens, my next book is about a new field of ingenuity, which I think is the life sciences. When I did Einstein, it was about a 50-year period of physics, beginning with his 1905 papers up to the atom bomb. And then I did information technology, with Steve Jobs and then the innovators. Now I think we're entering into a new generation that'll be defined by the life sciences, whether it's COVID or CRISPR, the gene editing technology. And there are a lot of young people who are leading the way. People of our generation wanted to make sure that our kids learned how to code digitally. I think now we're going to have to make sure our kids know how to do the genetic code. So I'm writing about Jennifer Doudna, who is a very young woman, read the double helix when she was in 6th grade, and she decided she wanted to become a scientist. And she decodes how RNA works and decodes how to turn it into something that's not just basic science, but ingenuity, which is CRISPR, which allows us to edit our genes. And this has become very useful in the age of COVID, because I think CRISPR-based technologies are what will eventually save us from viruses. But it will also raise those type of things that you have to do, which is the moral challenges of when do we edit our children? Do we make them taller? Do we give them higher IQ, bluer eyes, whatever we might say we would want? Or should we have the moral restraint, to go back to a phrase you used earlier, not to play Prometheus, not to fly too close to snatch the fire from the gods? And to me, and I wanted to get your reflections on this, it also always comes down to the moral questions that our ingenuity brings up.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question but that the life sciences are transforming our world, just as the physics revolution did, just as the information technology revolution did. And the moral questions are profound. I think when one talks about ingenuity, one has to put another word alongside it, which is the question of control. When does ingenuity sort of develop or become hyper-developed in a way that lends people or encourages people to think of themselves as having control that perhaps exceeds what they should realistically endeavor to secure? What do I mean by that exactly? I think the CRISPR technologies will give us incredible things. They will be transformative for medicine. At the same time, there is a real question about what the stakes of gene editing are. None of us actually knows the whole of what our genetic inheritance holds, and it would be a mistake to pretend that we do. And so in that regard, I do think and generally advocate for an attitude of humility in relationship to our use of these powers. I do think we should pull back from those kinds of efforts that would change the gene pool, for example. I think the last thing we want is a gene pool for our species that we ourselves have designed, because our minds are not infinite at the end of the day. For all that we may be ingenious and creative and so forth, our minds are not infinite, and the world is in fact infinite in its multiplicity and diversity. We will narrow it and confine it and limit it if we allow our minds too much control over the material that came before us and pre-exists us.
Well, as I write about Jennifer Doudna, Emmanuel Charpentier, and Feng Zhang at Harvard MIT, who have created this easy to use, and David Liu at Harvard now has done it, make it even easier to use. You're right. The question arises, okay, who should control that? And we have a system in our country that you write about so eloquently that tries to be based, or at least tip the scales towards individual liberty. But sometimes these decisions need to be made collectively, because, it's been 3 billion years that nature, or nature's God, has helped create that genome of the human species. If we come along and think that in 30 years we can rewrite it, we may be like Prometheus. We may be snatching fire from the gods in a way that could be dangerous for us. It also could deeply reduce the diversity of our society.
Exactly.
And by that, I don't just mean ethnic diversity, but if you were going to have a child who was going to be deaf, and you could easily edit out deafness from your hereditary code, many people would. But, being deaf, or being blind, or for that matter, being from, different ethnic and other cultural backgrounds, that diversity is not only good scientifically for our species, I think it's good for our morality and our social life, because it sort of says, hey, we're all in this together, and there but for the grace of God go I, so you feel a kinship to people who are different from you.
I fully agree with that, Walter. I think you put it very well. And I think for me, one of the challenges of human ingenuity is that we've not yet, in all of human history, managed to disconnect ingenuity from the misuse of our tools. So for the wonderful innovations of physics and Albert Einstein, one of the results ultimately was nuclear power and the devastation that the world saw with the atom bomb. With, with our wonderful political inventions, democracy, constitutionalism, and so forth, we nonetheless have managed to carry along with those wonderful inventions, tools and tactics of domination, including the endurance of enslavement, followed by Jim Crow, and so forth. So there is a real challenge at the heart of understanding human ingenuity, which is why, as we unleash our powers, we find it so hard to resist the temptations of using them in ways that are also detrimental to humankind.
And I think that's most evident when it comes to the digital revolution, because I celebrated what Steve Jobs did with the iPhone and with the innovators, which was a book I wrote about the inventors of the internet and social media. And the whole point was to connect us, to make us a world that shared more things, the way a book festival like this would. And now I have come to the belief that the lines have crossed, and the harm done to us by social media, especially by anonymity and this inability to have, what you would write about, which is sort of a civil society within the digital realm, is undermining our democracy, undermining our belief in factual information. And that's going to be one of the great challenges of the future, is to take that ingenuity and maybe put some of it back into the bottle.
So, one of the amazing things about the IT revolution is that its ingenuity has knocked out the pillars of the ingenuity of other generations. So just to make that very concrete, if the Constitution is an ingenious arrangement, James Madison is a person who gets credit for ingenuity in that instance. He was particularly proud in the Federalist Papers of the way in which the design was supposed to tamp down faction, right? Exactly those problems of misinformation and polarization that you were just describing. And when he explains why the design is going to tamp down polarization, there are two parts of the design that matter to him. One part is representation, the notion that we'll elect people and they'll filter views and synthesize and help us find a kind of moderating position. But the other thing that he actually thought would matter was the geographic dispersal of the population in the country, with rivers and mountains and so forth in between people. The idea was that the country was so vast, it would be very hard for people with extreme views to find one another and to acquire political power. Their geographical separation would require that they go through representations. Geography was a forcing function that would make representation do its job of tamping down function. So along comes our Jobs and our other figures in the IT revolution, and boom, there goes that pillar of geographic dispersal and distance that was actually holding up the entire structure of our constitutional edifice. An unintended consequence. So ingenuity often has unintended consequences, and that is one of the hardest things for all of us to know how to think about.
I'd like to ask you a moral question, because you deal with this all the time, which is the question of taking responsibility for what you do, and anonymity that we have now built into the architecture of the internet and to social media, where people can say things or platforms can amplify things on Facebook or whatever, where nobody has to take responsibility. And back when the founding of the nation happened, you write about the Federalist Papers, they were done with pseudonyms, and our friend Ben Franklin wrote under a variety of pseudonyms. But you always had a sense, I think back then, that people kind of could figure out who you were, and you had to be responsible for whatever you did. That was at the core of the First Amendment, was not just that you had the rights, but you had responsibilities. How do you see anonymity changing in a fundamental way, that notion of being responsible for your own ingenuity?
Well, I do think you're right that we need people to stand up and put their names to their ideas and their opinions and their contributions to the public sphere. Every society needs some room for anonymity because there is always need for whistleblowers. Sometimes people need protection in order to speak the truth. And so we can't forget that. Yet there's a balance. And so in that regard, we ought to be designing the tools of our social media engagements so as to require real names, to require authentication. That means that people have to take responsibility for their views, own them over time, know that they're interacting with other human beings who will also take responsibility for their views. I do think that's fundamental to functioning sort of moral dynamic of any healthy public sphere.
You know, I think it's important what you do as a professor at Harvard is making the connection between our ingenuity and our moral processing power. You raised the notion of the atom bomb, in which science ran ahead a little bit faster than our moral processing power, and we used the bomb twice, but then we're able to morally process it, to realize, as Colonel Henry Stimson and others did back then, that this was a new type of weapon, and we don't use it now. And often we're able to control ourselves. I just worry that things move so fast now that whether it's social media technology or gene editing and cloning technology, it might be able to outstrip not only our moral processing power, but our ability to think together as a civic unit and decide what we want to do as a society as opposed to what individuals might want to do.
I do think that's a critical issue. I'm a fan of a report written by the Biotechnology Commission for the federal government many years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago at this point, that argued precisely for establishing bodies of deliberation that would slow down our thought process, that would give us the chance to consider new technologies, begin to think through some of their downstream consequences before they are approved for broader use. We're habituated to this with things like the FDA, right, with new pharmaceuticals, for instance. And I think we want to figure out where else in our system of collective decision-making we can slow down our embrace of new technologies in order to be collectively deliberative.
And I think back on the great, most ingenious people I've written about, whether it's Jennifer Doudna today doing the CRISPR gene editing technology, or Albert Einstein with the bomb, or for that matter, Benjamin Franklin, who always wanted these civic groups to be formed. Jennifer Doudna is now leading them in terms of gene editing technology, but certainly Einstein was very much involved after the war with the committees that tried to figure out how to make sure we didn't use the bomb again. And so this is where I think the intersection of ingenuity and the civic engagement is so important.
Well, it's very often the case that ingenuity gives us new tools, new powers. That means it equips us with how to do things, but there's always the what and the why. Those are questions of morals, and those are questions that should never be left in the hands of experts. Experts can have a role to play, but it is hugely important that we recognize that those are human questions and that we engage broad publics in deliberating on the moral choices involved in which direction we use our tools. So I think that brings us back to the subject of culture, actually, in various ways, and why we need books, and why we need philosophy, why we need novels that explore ethical and moral dilemmas, works of psychology, and so forth, that help us all think about human well-being and human flourishing. We really need that kind of deep engagement with human questions in order to know to what ends we should put the tools of ingenuity.
One of the things that the current pandemic has reinforced for me is actually the importance of human interaction in person, getting together the way we have for about 4,000 or 5,000 years to create civic society. And that's what book festivals do. It's wonderful to do this in a virtual way. It shows the ingenuity where we can find ways to do things when we're prevented from doing them the way we used to. But I think that there's going to be a big hunger next year and in many future years for all of us to get together in person, to just have those serendipitous encounters where you run into a scientist and a poet and they start talking together. That happened. Steve Jobs was so deeply committed to building his headquarters and building so there'd be serendipitous encounters. Ben Franklin created his Leather Apron Club so people could get together that way. And I think that's what book festivals do, is in person, you get to bump into people and you get to have those encounters that cross-fertilize ideas.
I couldn't agree more with everything that Walter said. I think we're going to have to lift the rock of isolation that the pandemic has imposed on us. And book festivals are a brilliant way to do that, because our minds can wander then, they can discover new possibilities, but we do that with others. That human connection is so important, because understanding its value, understanding how we make meaning together, build a world of shared memories and of cultural artifacts that we love, that reminds us what our purposes are together. And then as we encounter great works of ingenuity, we have the resources of fellow feeling and solidarity that help us be ready for the hard moral choices, hard moral deliberations. At the end of the day, it really is our commitment to one another, to humanity, to our fellow human beings, that should guide us as we learn how to take the tools of the ingenious and seek to make our world a better place for all of us.
Danielle, it's always so exciting to be with you, and I want to thank everybody else who's been at this gala.
So much fun. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Library of Congress. You are a remarkable place.
Amen.
Many thanks again, Walter and Danielle, for that truly enlightening conversation. Let me take this final opportunity to direct all of you to the 20th Annual National Book Festival, which celebrates this same theme of American ingenuity. You can find the festival at loc.gov/bookfest. Thanks very much to all of you for joining us today.